One. All right, I want to. Today we're talking about Immanuel Kant, and the text is Prolegomena for any future metaphysics. So we went over the first reading in class, but I want to do a brief recap of some of the key ideas from the first sections, and then get into the latter sections. So as we're beginning with Kant, we're thinking about Kant in particular in relation to David Hume. Right? And we're thinking about Kant as responding to what is Hume's essential philosophical insight. Right? Hume's insight is that causation is non-empirical, that we don't ever see or in any other way have sensory experience of causation itself. And what we see, according to Hume, is instead constant conjunction. When I see myself release a pencil from my hand, every time the pencil falls to the table. Every time in the history of my life, I've seen this constant conjunction between releasing an object and it falling. What I don't ever see is the actual causal mechanism that I believe explains the relationship between these two events, my releasing the pencil and it dropping. Hume's, the meaning of Hume's observation, essentially, is that the empirical data we get, what we actually get through our senses, is a kind of meaningless jumble, in the sense that we don't get through our senses any explanation about the relations between things. Right? All we get is a series of impressions. How those impressions are related to each other, how we can understand one influencing the other through something like causation. All of that is going to be non-empirical. It's going to be our rational, intellectual organization of those impressions. Hume then shows how empty our empirical experience is. That is to say, the extent to which we get no meaning from it. So this is Kant's starting point. Right? That with empiricism alone, right, based on nothing but empiricism, we can have no solid ideas like ideas of causation. We can have no understanding of the world. So at the outset, right, Kant is thinking about how our understanding of reality in terms of causation, in terms of mathematics and the natural sciences, can relate to the physical world of empirical experience. If I don't get the idea of causation from empirical experience, why do I have this idea of causation? And more importantly, how is it that this idea of causation seems to organize and explain the empirical world, even though it is itself non-empirical. How can it be that mathematics, which I also don't get from the world, from experience, can have such power to explain the physical world? Right? Again, this is something that Hume shows or argues, right? That mathematics is not something that we get from empirical experience. We never, in our empirical experience, see or in any other way experience oneness. In our experience, everything can always be infinitely divided. And so what constitutes a unit and unity is arbitrary, right? Because it can always be divided further. So mathematics at the level of unity and identifying a one is not something that we get through empirical experience. And yet, right, mathematics, which is based on units, right, requires the concept of oneness. Mathematics explains and describes physical reality, empirical reality, very elegantly. So how can it be that these non-empirical ideas can so accurately explain the empirical world? This is essentially the problem that Kant wants to investigate. Now, as we said in class, right, Kant begins this investigation by making a distinction between analytic and synthetic truths. An analytic truth, an analytic idea, is an idea that derives from the concept itself, right? An idea that is included in the concept of the thing cognized. So, for example, the classic example, that a bachelor is an unmarried man is an analytic idea. Right? Within the concept bachelor is contained the idea unmarried man. So an analytic idea is an idea that derives from itself, essentially, that is self-identical. And Kant says all analytic ideas are based on the principle of non-contradiction. Right? The principle of non-contradiction states that a thing cannot be both itself and not itself simultaneously. That a thing cannot contradict itself. A thing cannot be both itself and not itself at the same time. And so all analytic truths are going to be based on the principle of non-contradiction because, right, what a thing is will tell us what a thing is. It can't contradict itself. It can't be opposite of what itself, of what it is. So analytic truths will be, we could think of it either conceptually, or we could say something like the concept of a bachelor implies the idea of an unmarried man, or experientially, right? That the experience of red is this impression of redness that I have. Right? There's an analytic truth to that, right? The impression I'm having is the impression I'm having, that the idea I'm having is the idea I'm having. We could, yeah. So, analytic truths are self-evident. A synthetic truth, on the other hand, is a truth that Kant says amplifies or adds to the inherent analytic truth in a concept. So a synthetic idea will be a combination, a synthesis of two ideas, a synthesis of two things, not something that comes directly from the thing itself. Now, this synthesis, this relation between two things, is the most important point, right? Because what is it that Hume says we don't have empirical experience of? He says it is the relations among things, right? Relation is what we don't have empirical experience of. Having an experience of an impression and another impression, but how those two impressions are related, I don't experience. I can only arrive at a relation between those two impressions through reflection, right? Through thinking. So relation is non-empirical. Now, this distinction between analytic and synthetic truths that concerns Kant concerns specifically a priori analytic and synthetic truths. What this means is an idea that exists prior to experience or outside of experience, independently of experience. So I can know a priori without ever having any experience that a bachelor is an unmarried man. I don't need to meet a bachelor. I don't need to have an experience with a bachelor. I don't need to compare a lot of different bachelors in order to arrive at the conclusion that a bachelor is an unmarried man. Right? I can do all that a priori because contained within the concept bachelor is the idea unmarried man. Right? I don't need to refer to the world of experience in order to know that a bachelor is an unmarried man. I can arrive at that conclusion a priori, right, based solely on an analysis of the concept itself. Now, generally, synthetic ideas, synthetic truths, are not a priori, right? That the pencil falls when I release it from my fingers is a synthetic truth, right? The first phenomenon, the first event, my releasing the pencil between my fingers, is separate from the second event, phenomenon, the pencil falling. Right? To say the pencil falls because I released it is a synthetic truth, a synthetic idea. It synthesizes those two events and says, right, the one is related to the other in this way. We explain this relation, this synthesis, through causation. So causation will be a synthetic idea, combines two ideas. However, we can think of, Kant thinks, much simpler synthetic truths. And again, he's relying on Hume here, or developing one of Hume's ideas, which is that, again, mathematics is ultimately a question of relation, question of reflection, and is non-empirical. Kant thinks mathematics provide us with synthetic, not analytic truths. That when I contemplate the formula 2 + 2 = 4, right, I am contemplating a synthetic idea. Right? 2 + 2 = 4. Addition and right, conclusion, solution are relations. I cannot know, Kant thinks, from merely the concept of two-ness or the concept of fourness that 2 + 2 = 4. So I cannot have an analytic idea that provides me with knowledge of this idea that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I can't get it from just the concept of 2 or just the concept of 4. I have to create a synthetic idea, 2 plus 2 equals 4, in order to arrive at this idea. But what is important here is that this kind of synthetic idea can exist a priori, independently of all experience. That I'm able to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 without ever referring to the world of experience, right? Without ever having to actually get 2 different units and another 2 units and demonstrate the truth of 2 plus 2 equals 4 by bringing them together in the physical realm. So, the first big question that Kant asks here, and introduces the whole Prolegomena, all of the Prolegomena, is how are these synthetic truths possible? How is it possible to have an a priori synthetic idea? That is to say, how is it possible that I'm able to do mathematics without reference to the physical world? Now, as we'll see by the end of today, the real conundrum, the real difficulty here is not just how is it possible to have a priori synthetic judgments, synthetic ideas, but more troublingly, how can it be that these synthetic a priori ideas I have, like mathematics, are also applicable to nature, to the external world, to physical, sensorial reality, right? And so the question there is, how can something that happens in my mind, independently of any physicality at all, and that doesn't require any physicality at all, or an encounter with any appearances, how can something that exists, is able to exist solely in my mind, also be that which provides a universal description of the physical world? Right? How is it that a priori ideas, like those in mathematics, or, as we'll see, those of the natural sciences, can at one and the same time be non-empirical, that is, a priori, able to exist independently of any physical existence, and also simultaneously be that which provides a description of the necessary and universal laws that govern the physical appearing and sensory world? The next step in this argument will be to explain Kant's idea of intuition. That the way that these a priori synthetic judgments are possible, the way that we're able to have, right, how we're able to construct a synthetic a priori judgment, is through intuition. Now, intuition is a crucial idea for Kant, and it means something very specific. For Kant, intuition is not, a sort of sense of what to do, right? I intuit that you're feeling, mad at me today, or I intuit um, that you want me to do the dishes tonight, right? Whatever, anything having to do with the physical world or sort of predictions about the physical world, the way intuition is used colloquially today, right? That's not what Kant means by intuition. Intuition is a technical term that refers for Kant to what he calls the form of sensibility. Intuition is the form of our sensibility. So what does this mean? Intuition is the form of sensibility. Well, first we'd have to explain or understand what sensibility is, or how Kant thinks about sensibility in general. So sensibility refers to our empirical capacity, right? The capacity to have empirical experience is our sensibility. That we're able to have a sensory experience of the world at all is a function of human sensibility. Now, sensibility is going to have a content, some certain content, right? The content of sensibility will be the information that you get through your senses. Right? So the content of sensibility will be what you see, hear, feel, smell, and taste. Right? Any information that comes through your five senses. The content of your sensibility will itself be conditional, right? It will take a certain form, right? In the sense that the kinds of content we get will be restricted to the kinds of sensory receptors that we have. So I am able to see extremely well, hear slightly less well, smell considerably less well, taste even less well, and feel some certain amount. I have this certain sensory capacity. And that gives me only a certain amount of information, a window onto the empirical world. But in no way can I say that this gives me all of the information that I would need about the empirical world in order to say that I understand it perfectly. We can imagine that there would be a sixth or seventh or eighth sense that would reveal entirely unimagined and unthought of, right, unthinkable forms of experience. If there were a sixth or seventh sense, I wouldn't even know what kind of information I would get through it. Right? There's some speculation, for example, that certain animals, perhaps even all animals, have some ability to sense magnetism and magnetic polarity. I don't want to get into that. I don't know enough about it, right? But that's kind of an example of what an additional sense might be. It would give us some immediate new kind of information. And one of the interesting things about Kant is that he's really interested in the conditions for the possibility of experience in general. Not what Kant does not do is assume that human experience is the ultimate form of experience, right? That we have the most refined and best experience, and thus the fullest knowledge of reality. So Kant will say, Kant will imagine that, Kant will say, we can imagine that there might be aliens, right? Extraterrestrials. They would have entirely different sense faculties, would sense the world in entirely different ways. The world would appear entirely different to them. They would still have some kind of sensory content to work with. right? But what that content is may be different. So similarly, right, a dog is going to get different sensory content than a human. Right? A dog has a much better sense of smell than it has a sense of eyesight. Right? So the content of sensory experience for a dog will largely be olfactory, right? Will be smell, whereas the sensory content for humans is largely visual. Right? We rely on our eyes more than our other senses. So what we get through our senses, the content of our sensibility, is already conditioned by our particular sensory faculties, our senses. Content is what our senses pick up, and that is limited by the kinds of sense that we have, the number of senses that we have, etc. However, there is a larger idea of the form of sensibility in distinction from the content of sensibility for Kant. The form of sensibility will ultimately be given by this thing he calls intuition. Intuition provides the form of sensibility as space and time. Right? So, the content of sensibility, what we actually sense, the sense data we get through our senses, is in the first place conditioned, restricted, constrained by our particular powers of sensation, our sense faculties. But the real key is that every content we get through our senses has to fit a certain form, a form that is more universal than any particular kind of sense. Right? So our eyes right, condition sensory input in a certain way. They receive light. Right? Our ears receive sound. Our noses receive sense. Right? Each one, therefore, engages with the sensory empirical world in a different way and is unique and particular. So that the kind of limitation that's put on sensory content by our eyes or our ears is not universal. Right? The universal form, the true form that is necessarily given to sensibility, the form that is necessary for all of our senses, sight and hearing, smell and touch, all of them, must be universal and abstract in order to govern all of our senses and our entire array of sensory faculties. This form of sensibility will be space and time, the intuitions of space and time. So space and time are intuitions, forms of sensibility. What that means is that all sensory information that we receive has to fit into the form of space and time. Our sight, our hearing, etc. Everything happens in space and time, has the form of spatiality, temporality. The form of sensibility allows for synthetic a priori ideas by providing, as it were, the blank canvas on which any kind of sensory experience must be represented, through which any sensory experience must be represented. So if we can think about time and space as a kind of container into which all sensory experience must fit, a kind of blank canvas on which our senses are projected, that make those senses able to be represented to us. And it's through that same intuition, that same blank canvas, that these a priori synthetic judgments are possible. Right? We're only able to understand the possibility of a relationship between my releasing the pencil and the pencil falling because we connect those two events spatially and temporally. Right? Space and time are the connections, the relations that provide the possibility of positing a causal relationship between releasing the pencil and it falling. Right? It's only because in the first place those two events happen in space and time that we can imagine any relationship between them. Similarly, synthetic a priori judgments, like mathematics or natural sciences, are possible on the basis of this pure intuition, which again is not empirical, but is the condition for the possibility of empirical experience. Again, I don't see or in any other way experience space and time in the relation between releasing the pencil and it falling. Rather, space and time are conditions for the possibility of experiencing any relation between releasing the pencil and it falling. Space and time are conditions for the possibility of experience. Conditions for the possibility of experience as the form of sensibility that allows sensibility to operate. Space and time, therefore, are themselves a priori. They exist independently of the realm of appearances, the physical world of empiricism. Space and time are a priori, non-empirical. They are in our mind. We'll talk about what this means much more in a minute. For now, what's important is to grasp how the internality of these intuitions of space and time makes these synthetic a priori judgments possible. And we touched on this a little bit in class. Synthetic a priori judgments work on the same, as it were, blank canvas that the empirical world does. I'm able to say 2 + 2 = 4 without ever making reference to the empirical world. through reference instead to those pure a priori intuitions of space and time. So I'm able to say, right, if we think about the timeline, right, that I experience temporality as succession, as linear time, as moving unidirectionally. I'm able to say, here I am at T1 and T2 and T3 and so on. And that time succession is not connected to empirical experience. The time succession exists even when I'm thinking abstractly, independently of any empirical experience. It exists when I'm sleeping, right? When I'm imagining a world that is completely divorced from the real world of appearances. So, this time scale, this succession of events, is a necessary part, not just of empirical experience, but also of these a priori synthetic judgments. Because how do I arrive at this mathematical idea of 2 plus 2 equals 4? By reference to that intuition of time. I have moment 1 and moment 2, T1 and T2. Then I have T3 and T4. I'm able to, a priori, entirely abstractly, add those moments together, right, and see that 2 plus 2, right, T1 and T2 plus T3 and T4 equals the sum of 4. So that mathematics is able to apply to pure intuition without reference to any sensory content. And that this is how synthetic a priori judgments are possible. All right, so we're going to take a break here, and we'll come back and think about the other implications of this idea that time and space are forms of sensibility, intuitions, and the implications of the possibility of a priori synthetic judgments.